I'm going to very quickly whip round so that you can have an introduction to all of the speakers that will be taking you through this third and final session. So why don't we start with, in alphabetical order, Richard, Robert, and then we'll come to me.
Hi, Dan. It's great to be here. Thanks for organising a brilliant event for us. My name is Richard Sandell. I'm co-director of the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester, one of the founding partners of the network.
And I am Robert Taylor, portrait and figure photographer, working in several fields. I have a strange background to the work that I do, having come from the military and the law, but for the last 35 years, basically making portrait collections with strategic implications for institutions, but also lacing queer practice into that wherever I can.
This session is entitled "What Difference Can We Make?" It's trying to understand what impact, what consequences flow from queer heritage practice. And I'm going to just kick off with a short presentation and then hand back to Dan and Robert to explore some of these issues, and there'll be a chance for Q&A, of course, at the end. So just by way of introduction, I carried out a 10-year study, an international study of how museums and heritage sites have treated queer and LGBTQ histories over time. And it was particularly to try and answer this question: what difference does it make? Or to put another way, why is queer heritage important in the world? And one of the things I did, which I'm going to just talk briefly about now, is I researched the experiences of queer and equality activists. So as well as looking at people in museums, I wanted to focus very much on people who were primarily concerned with equality, who were not part of our world, of our museum and heritage world. And I wanted to try and understand why, with all that they were facing, why did they take the effort and the time to protest in and around museums and heritage sites? Why did they think that those stories and the way they're told was important? And I'm going to share 3 quick examples to give a sense of what I found. The first one goes back to 2010, Hide Seek. Difference and Desire in American Portraiture was the first major show at the Smithsonian in Washington, DC, to explore gender diversity and same-sex love in a substantive way. And the exhibition was critically acclaimed, and it prompted many positive responses from visitors. But it also quickly attracted the attention of the Catholic League, that mounted a campaign to remove just one work from the exhibition, a video work by David McAlmont, which featured an 11-second scene of ants crawling on a crucifix. The Smithsonian secretary at that time pulled the video remarkably quickly, in fact, around fears that the newly elected Republican House of Representatives might impose budget cuts on the Smithsonian. And that decision sparked an outcry from queer activists, from the public, and from the arts world. And in a particularly creative move, activists first sought to reinsert the removed artwork back into the gallery. The iPad protesters, as they became known, went into the gallery, one standing with within the exhibition itself, with the censored video playing on the tablet screen around his neck, while his companion filmed the responses from the public and the growing unease amongst security guards before they were both arrested. And soon after, they raised funds to set up what they called the Museum of Censored Art, and to put that right outside the National Portrait Gallery. Hopefully you can see that on the screen now. I interviewed one of the protesters, Mike Blazenstein, a few years afterwards, and this is what he told me. This is an extract from the interview. My main motivation for setting up the Museum of Censored Art was to refute the idea that gay people were not just as much a part of this country as anyone else. The Smithsonian isn't just a museum, it's the official museum of the United States, for better or worse. To be included is finally to have made it. It's official. You deserve to be seen on an equal footing with everyone else in this country. That's what the bigots objected to, and that is why I was so devastated when the exhibit was censored. My next example, again from the US, is an exhibition called Art AIDS America, which was showing at the Tacoma Art Museum in 2015. Tacoma artist Christopher Paul Jordan, in this interview extract, explains his expectations on first visiting the exhibition. And again, I think it helps us understand why the stories we tell and how we tell them are so important. Christopher said, "As a black male walking through the exhibition on the opening, I was anticipating a show that was deeply representative of black people. I went with a friend. We were so excited to see what work was in the space, basically because demographically, HIV is us, and we expected to see a lot of work relevant to our experiences. I walked into the show excited that it was happening, a historical moment. I was proud that the museum was doing this. I kept walking around waiting to see more black artists, black trans women, and I only saw a couple of pieces. I felt like I was back in the 1980s where my life didn't matter." And Jordan raised his concerns about the show's depiction of AIDS as a white crisis, as he saw it, at a panel discussion at the museum in November 2015, but dissatisfied with the responses he received, Jordan asked the Tacoma Action Collective to organise a protest at the museum. And a few weeks later, he joined members of the collective who staged a die-in to protest the lack of black representation in the exhibition. A final example, just coming back to the UK, and you've heard about our work with the National Trust and Prejudice and Pride. And one of the things we did alongside Girl Boy Child and Exile, and working with Rachel and the team to think through the ethical implications and strategies for that programme, at the end of it, we carried out a detailed study of audience engagement and responses to that programme. And it's important, our findings, I think, because if you saw the headlines, particularly from right-wing press at that time, and the programme was on the front page of most newspapers for the best part of 2 weeks, it was an unprecedented level with screaming headlines, which suggested that a majority of people were horrified by what we did. Our detailed study of audience responses, and we looked at more than 1,500 individual people's responses, revealed a very different picture, a much more positive, much more complex picture. Over 70% of people supported the Trust's decision to celebrate queer lives, and the study revealed the capacity for queer heritage to fundamentally change people's attitudes, to challenge prejudice and discrimination, to build support and understanding for LGBTQ equality. So to finish, I want to say that queer heritage matters. It matters a great deal, that visibility in the public realm, and cultural institutions of all kinds have got a very powerful role to play in shaping the conditions within which LGBTQ equality, dignity and respect can flourish and be advanced. I'm going to finish there, but you can find out more. Dan's been great putting some links in the chat. There's some material in the programme, but also on our RCMG website with a full detail of that methodology and findings. I hope that's a useful introduction. Back to you, Dan.
It's a very provocative introduction, I think. So thank you, Richard. Robert, if you could turn your video and your audio on while I just come back to the slides momentarily, because I said to Richard that I would kind of only do this if I had a chance to have a chat with Robert Taylor about what difference can we make by actually showing a picture that for me is one of the most iconic images in our whole heritage sector, which is here with David McAlmont, who we've already seen, and you heard me fangirling over before, Richard Sandell and Robert Taylor, obviously showing that they are part of a wonderful all singing, all dancing troupe called what's the band called again?
Well, let's call them the Lipettes for now, but we can do better.
The Lipettes.
Yeah.
So I'm going to close up the screen now. So if you've not had a chance to screenshot that, do it now very quickly.
Outrageous.
I mean, let's start with that question, Robert, when we're thinking about this, what difference can we make? What difference does it make to you? And how do you think that a difference can be made?
Well, what difference it's made to me? I mean, I need to start right where we are with the last 2 days. I've been in this program, and it's been a revelatory and celebratory experience, having a completely refreshed idea of what can happen in institutions and museums and places like that. And I must admit, I come from a fairly traditional standpoint and hadn't realized how much dynamic work there is for institutions to come out to communities, reach out, and really draw people in to participate in something, and not just think of museums and history and all of that as something that's given to us by experts. There's so many opportunities to engage. So that's my point of excitement. And then, of course, we're working with people like Richard and David McAlmont, who show that despite their great erudition and depth, there's also fun to be had here. You know, history is a living, dynamic thing. And but it's also made me realize in a humbling way that there's a lot more to history that I'm involved in. I've been doing my work in very queer spaces and traditional spaces, and not realizing that I am part of that history. It's not something that comes before me in a kind of a dusty institution for basically upper middle class white folks. We're all part of it. And there are lots of things about the work I've been doing, the people I've been with, the fun I've been having, the struggles I've been having. They're all history as well.
And when we're talking about David McAlmont and Richard, I mean, the picture, the context in that picture, we should probably explain a little bit more as well.
Well, as a loving contribution to some of the spaces, the royal palaces, we'd made a visit to Hampton Court to see a collection of, I think, 16th century portraits of classic beauties. And we were really interested in exploring the whole idea of what beauty is, who it's defined by, and how we could really enliven a conversation about beauty, speaking about right now, by taking, let's say for argument's sake, a collection of really dynamic contemporary Black drag queens, and putting them in that environment and inviting comparisons and contrasts between these traditional solid ideas of beauty, something much more contemporary. And of course, it's a complicated inquiry in some ways, because there are things that we're struggling with trying to work things out in a contemporary setting. And then we go into these grand environments and we find things are not quite as they seem. And also trying to find ways to do that that are entertaining and alluring for visitors who are coming in. So they're not just thinking it as some kind of woke attack on the establishment, but something enriching, something to expand what they're coming to see, not just to sort of be contemporary for the sake of it. Would that be a fair summary, Richard?
Yeah, I think that's it. That's exactly it. I mean, we've made a couple of visits, and Robert and David and I have spent some time honing ideas. We need to seek funding for that, which is what will help us take it forward, to supplement some funding. The university put in some seed funding to enable us to start research and look at how we could bridge kind of authentic histories from those different sites and the paintings that Robert referred to, and bring them into conversation with contemporary Black lives and people who are much less visible and held up in the public realm. And we want to kind of explore that in a fun, creative, engaging way. Fingers crossed.
And when you're thinking about being fun, engaging, and to you, Robert, how far ahead are you thinking of the impact that will be made? How far ahead are you thinking about the difference that you'll be making as well?
Well, I think that I speak in terms of hope, that a confidence statement about where we're going to get, because the process, if it's going to work, we're going to be setting up the final offer as the beginning of a conversation. And it'll only take shape and have meaning as we get feedback from visitors who are not just coming to gaze at something, but participate in some ways. And it comes alive. I mean, there was something at Eltham House that an event you had yesterday in this program, and I found that deeply moving, because it was so obviously it was partly constructed out of the responses of the guests to the house, people who are coming in, some who didn't know that what they were coming into. And my hope would be that what we're looking at would be shaped in similar ways by people who come into the installations and give us responses and engage with us, you know, in whatever form, you know, that the offer takes.
Because we had a rather unique experience together, which was you came to the V&A Museum with me, and we went to the Prints and Drawings Room, and you got to experience, as a visitor, your own work.
Yes, well, it was particularly special for me because coming into photography in the art world as self-taught, having work being taken into the collection to places like the National Portrait Gallery and, as you say, the V&A was particularly exciting. And to go in and find myself in a box of photographs with Mishima and you know, other great names, and yes, this is real, that what I am exploring, and the fact that it's about Black and queer and misogyny and all sorts of other things, and this is considered as relevant as anything else. It makes you think, well, what else is possible, you know? Because if you come from my background, you relate to these institutions and these histories as being over there and about somebody else, and going in and finding that you're part of it is very, very exciting.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that interaction with that, you know, that you had with your work? What was that like? Because I remember you sort of had a very particular word for it.
Gosh.
It was vibrant, or it wasn't vibrant, it was a V word.
Well, how can I put it without making it become almost like a sexual experience? It was incredibly exciting to open this box. There's a reverence because it's an internationally renowned archive. The work is held with great care, peeling back these delicate sheets of tracing paper, and there is the work. And in that setting, and I should also state that part of the experience that thrilled me was meeting contemporary curators. Because again, things are changing. The people who are now in charge of these fabulous collections, the education, the ideas, the backgrounds they come from, I mean, they're making it so much richer. The pieces of work that I have in the V&A collection now were donated acquired by the museum in the early 90s. Now, we're in, you know, 21st century, and the meaning of that work has changed. So there's an ongoing conversation. Perhaps the biggest thrill for me was not only just sitting there and seeing my work in the collection, but realizing that there are other things that museums could do to bring the collection to life. I mean, I would love to have a discussion with people now about pieces of work that are in the V&A that deal with race and difference and the homoerotic connection, because the meaning has changed in 30 years from the time when they first went in. Well,
Zoran Clayton, who you met, was keeper of Prints and Drawings at the time as well, and had a chat with you. And one of the remarkable things I think for me is the point in which we acquired it. Obviously, Section 28 was still in play, and so the homoerotic is probably the safer word to use. It's probably one of the most searched terms that we've got in our search collection. But now we'd probably say that, you know, there's homosexual elements to it. We could actually say on the label now, this is an LGBTQ plus. It's in an LGBTQ plus box that's in the Prints and Drawings Room that can be called by anybody who comes in. And so that idea of accessibility and the idea that anybody can come in and see it when they want to is very different. And being able to put a label on things as well, sometimes in this case, for a collections perspective, coming from here, we've got the symposium of people working in collections, being able to say that this is a relevant, important object for the LGBTQ plus community. That's a shift, that's a difference as well. And so I wondered if you could tell me about some of your reflections with how you feel that it's changed for you coming in as an artist, how you feel the sector has changed as well, and how you want it to continue to change.
Well, it's a mostly positive story in the sense that, for instance, there are images not only of my work, but I think there's an image of me in the collection. I think parts of me are featured, which frankly, I wouldn't have dreamt of being in there even 15, 20 years ago. So that's the good news, that the presence keeps making more and more possible. On the other hand, I suppose there is now an expectation that people like me and my work should be there. And I suppose I want to be sure that it's still a genuine exercise and that we're not just covering quotas. Because although we've made an awful lot of progress, I think the events of certainly last year, in terms of Black Lives Matter and things like that, make us realize there are deeper understandings of things, and it's not just a tick box exercise. Well, we've got blacks, we've got gays, we've got lesbians, so we're now covered with equality. How are people really valued, and what kind of conversations are people having that might make them uncomfortable or might make them think quite differently about something they thought was settled business?
Well, if we're going to talk about values, can we talk about family values, and can we talk about chosen family values? Because in terms of working with contemporary photographers and emerging photographers as well, this is a really important project for you.
Oh, tremendously so. Levi Strauss sponsored an exhibition that was looking at the whole idea of chosen families, non-biological families, families that lots of queer folk are sometimes obliged to create because the traditional family either is not interested or in many cases hostile. And it's one of the most moving pieces of work I've done in quite a while. And it actually connects with David McAlmont, funnily enough. Going back to the 1980s, I first met somebody called Bill Wilcox. And back in the day, I also met, not long after that, David McAlmont. And then later came also somebody called Lorne, and then somebody else called Kenny. And these four people, I've always noticed that they function as a family. They're way more than mates or ex-lovers. And if you turn up to lots of social and arts and cultural events, if you see one, you know there's going to be at least another one of the foursome. And they paid me the great honor and privilege, really, of being allowed to gently interrogate this and make sure that I understood what it was I was noticing, and take fairly relaxed, intimate photographs that showed different aspects of the way they relate, symbolizing aspects of the relationships. And there's bonds between them and the way that they relate. It's as much a piece of queer activism as anything else I've seen, because it's saying we're not at the margins, we count. And perhaps most importantly, we can take care of ourselves as well as trying to relate to a wider community.
That's amazing. Thank you. Richard, have you got any thoughts, reflections on what we've been chatting with Robert about?
I've got a question for Robert, if that's okay. Robert, one of your opening remarks was, I think it's when you introduced yourself, you talked about obviously your work as a photographer, but you said something like work that has strategic implications for institutions, or it has, and it was, you were hinting, I think, at the aims, the ambition behind the aesthetic work itself. Can you say a little bit more about that in relation to what you want that work to do, to achieve?
Right. Well, the essence of it is actually nominally outside the queer realm altogether. I get commissioned pretty regularly by Oxford University colleges, very grand, quite often wealthy and heritage-rich institutions. And I think it's fair to say now that functionally, Oxford University in most ways is functionally co-educational. Women are represented at every level. But if you go into their major social spaces, which is the dining halls and other parts of their grand buildings, usually grand buildings, you'll find that they're still dominated by oil-painted portraits of dead men. Beautiful artworks, very grand, but completely out of tune with a lot of what's going on now. So it's not a question of taking them out, but my portrait collections of leading women alumni who are selected for all sorts of reasons that distinguish them are there to be hung usually in the midst, occasionally instead of, but definitely to sort of equalize some of the weight of the gender presence. And the impact is to reflect the reality that's there functionally, but also to push things a bit, because although, as with race and sexuality, although we've come a very long way, I think it would be naive to think that we aren't still in some ways dominated by residues of the old idea that it's supposed to be a man and he's supposed to come from a certain background. And putting these pictures up is also is always quite a radical thing. And I get vertigo sometimes, and a kind of vertigo when they're being hung and you're thinking, if it doesn't go well this time, will it be me that cops for it? There is a lovely queer postscript to these events because they're lavish and say quite wealthy institutions. And usually after it's been hung, there'll be some major black tie dinner. And I'm always invited, and I always get taken to top table, and I'm always asked, you know, would I like to bring a guest? And then suddenly I become a black queer man, because at that point, people get to see who did the pictures. And sitting there next to the president and Lord this and Lady that is this black queen with his husband. And there's suddenly this queering. And nobody said bats an eyelid, of course, because they're all incredibly well adjusted and know what to say. But you know it's a bit of a thing, particularly looking like me, going into those spaces. So yeah, yes, it's essentially about, you know, bringing gender balance, but as it's me doing it, there's something else going on all the time. And I have any number of interactions with people at every level of these institutions while I'm working there. So it's quite a ride.
I love that about your work. I think you're being very modest, really. I mean, not only is it sort of stunning work, but it has a symbolic value, but you said something like pushing things a bit further. And I think it's in that really exciting space. It does a lot of that kind of pushing in terms of what people take away from it and the kind of consequences that then has. So yeah, fantastic. We've got some questions, Dan.
We do. And so I'm going to put this one to both of you, because I think it's actually going to be interesting to kind of get both of your views on this, which is from Anonymous. It says, do you think it's essential that queer people in an organization lead these kinds of activities if queer communities are involved, and if queer communities are involved in shaping the work? It's an if rather than an and, I should just actually say. Is it essential queer people lead these activities if queer communities are involved in shaping the work?
I mean, I could jump in first, and I think it's a great question, because it's speaking to the idea of who gets to tell their histories, which has been a thread that's come through this symposium. So on the one hand, it's hugely important that we empower queer communities to be active in shaping the ways their lives, their stories, their perspectives are presented. That has to be at the heart of the practice. It has to be very participatory and ethical in that sense. But the people that might initiate and lead that in the institution, I would say, don't have to be from the community. They have to work ethically and respectfully with that, just as they would with all sorts of communities. That would be my own view. Otherwise, I think it limits, we need institutions unequivocally to commit to this work and take that forward, regardless of their own lived experience. It shouldn't be down to a queer person to champion that in the institution. The institution should be doing it anyway.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. I suppose one thing I'd add in a very practical sense, I've been commissioned several times when working with friends who've worked in, say, major banks, and they've had equality drive, diversity drives, and they've wanted to push, racial or gender identity or sexuality. And there's this concept of identified allies. So I've been commissioned to take portraits of a collection of people who are driving some human rights initiative. But it's I found it so moving to see how many either straight people or men, if it's about women or whatever it is, who come in and identify as allies. So they're absolutely clear it is not their identity, but they see it as not having any meaning unless it's a joint effort to upgrade the conversation. So I think it has to be, for me, it has to be mixed.
Now, I've got a question here from Helen Dafter, which is drawing on the concept of chosen family. So inspired by what you've just said, Robert, how can we incorporate that idea into programming, especially for events without a specific LGBTQ plus focus? Have you got any thoughts on how we can make our wider programming welcoming and inclusive?
Richard, is that more your territory?
I don't know if I'm grasping the question properly, but one of the things I think might be interesting is if it's talking about programming for families, there's often a very kind of normative view by cultural institutions of the family generally being a non-queer family. And so what could be done to enable the very different kinds of families that are configured in very different ways to be welcomed by our cultural institutions. I think that's where the question's coming from. What do you think, Robert?
Well, I'm reminded of something. A very old friend of mine has just given end-of-life care to, he's in his 60s, but to a much older friend in their 80s who's just died. And the friend championing his care and dealing with various care institutions had some uncomfortable, not hostile, but uncomfortable exchanges with somebody in a care setting who was asking what the relationship was. And it took a lot of energy to get this person to understand they weren't lovers, he wasn't his son or nephew, they were family in a queer way. And the only way I can see those conversations being reduced in either their intensity or the need to have them at all is for more stories, more exhibitions and exhibits that explore, amongst other things, this idea that there is queer family for all sorts of reasons, not just hostility. We have not only the burden, but the opportunity to reinvent the whole idea of what family is, how it can function, and what it can show to mainstream conventional thinking about family. So I just want to see, not necessarily trying to thread it into policy, but just more artistic representation of queer, intimate connection so that people get it. You know, it's not just kids and children, you know, kids and parents and all of that conventional stuff, but take an inventory of human beings' needs and show how we can be really creative about it and how we have been creative about it over time.
We have a question in that sort of says, we've seen examples of censorship or underrepresentation in exhibitions, but do you both have examples that you think got it right in terms of curation, approaching to the approach to curation, as well as the final outcome? Have you got any highlights in your mind, you know, exhibitions that you think that really, really is strong? And I might tip you off as well, Robert. I mean, you're in one.
Is it my weary old body again? Is it? Well, I think the masculinity exhibition at Barbican recently, although because it was about men, there was inevitably going to be quite a considerable homoerotic element. I really enjoyed the way that Rotimi Fene-Kayode's work was brought in the sense that he works with this, I mean, he's trained, he has a fine art Western training, but he brings a whole lot of very important and significant West African cultural and spiritual history as well. And his work is a wonderful, beautiful, mysterious fusion of these different perspectives. And I think seeing that work in what could otherwise have been quite a kind of a clinical Western white setting, looking at masculinity as a sociology exercise, it was very rich, but it's hard to articulate that. You need to see the images. But I think, Dan, you were teasing me because I am inadvertently in one of the images. There is a beautiful image of three black torsos sectioned, and you can make it mean so many different things. And not a lot of people know that I'm one of the bodies. Is that what you?
That was, I mean, there's any number of exhibition in London at the moment where you're actually featured in it as well. And you mentioned earlier that the V&A picture that you were in, it was also a Rotimi Fene-Kayode picture as well that you were, that is in the collection with you in it. So I have got a question from Ellie Armstrong. Hello, Ellie. And Ellie, she/her, would like to know, and from both of you, from both of you, what are some of the challenges to doing LGBTQ plus inclusive work, and what are some of your suggestions or strategies to work through these challenges?
Well, the first one that comes to mind, which goes back to my first relationship with a major national gallery, was when I sold work to the National Portrait Gallery. And because of a very happy set of accidents in my social network, somebody said, you really should take your pictures to the National Portrait Gallery, take a portfolio. And I was reluctant, thinking, not for me, they're not going to be into what I do. But I was eventually persuaded to go in, have a meeting with the curator of photographs, Terence Pepper. And it was very humbling. He liked the work. I thought I was just going to be sent away with a pat on the head. He bought 8 pieces straight away. And he was not only interested in Sir This and Lady That from my posh work. He wanted to see the queer work and the more social activist stuff. So in addition to 6 gonged subjects, I was also selling them a picture of Marsha Hunt, a black singer and writer, but also Isaac Julian. And I think it's one of their first out black queer acquisitions, where it was somebody who wasn't outed later. They already made their name as a queer practitioner. So my point is, particularly these days, not to assume that these citadels are resistant, notwithstanding the great work that Richard and David and others have done. There's some really open-minded and creative thinking in a lot of our institutions, and we should not assume that we're necessarily pushing against a lot of resistance. If you bring work of quality, people are open and want to see what you've got and want to include you. And that was a big surprise to me, because that was not what I was expecting at all.
I mean, I definitely agree with that, but I think it's quite uneven, the appetite for and sort of interest, isn't it? And it's really encouraging that there are definitely, there is an openness, and we've seen a real flourishing of interest and activity. But there's also still massive nervousness and and resistance, and sometimes that's homophobia, more transphobia. More often, I think it's a nervousness and uncertainty about what it involves. And I guess in my experience, and Rachel alluded to it earlier, that kind of deep working with people on a very sort of human level, the staff, the volunteers, the people who are going to embark on that journey. So taking time for them to understand what it means, what it means to people to tell those stories, what it's meant for those stories to have been actively silenced, what harm that does. And most people, I've met people across the spectrum of anger and resistance through to sort of open arms. Most people are open when you take some time to do that. There might be an initial resistance, but some of the most challenging but most productive projects have been where I've kind of done mass participation, taken a huge number of people who wouldn't naturally think of an interest in this topic and draw them in ways that let them. I think the quality that Robert talks about is key. So quality of the art or the interpretation, the depth of confidence of the research that underpins it, but also an understanding of what it actually means to people when you do this work and you do it well. And most people then are kind of good and want to get on board.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to say very briefly, I wouldn't want to underestimate the presence of resistance in some quarters, of course. It's just that when I look back over the last 30 years of my career, I would still say that the biggest barrier to my progress, whether as a black, queer or working class origin person, is not the external barriers, but self-censorship and fear of stepping into spaces where I thought I might meet resistance. That, I think, has been the biggest thing for me, not what I've met in hostility.
Thank you both. Now I'm going to just blast through 2 questions I think I can answer, which is, this is from Molly Kingwin, who wants to know a general question about QHCN, whether an individual not associated with a collection or a GLAM can join. And I think that given that it's such a high percentage, I think that there's a case for that now. So I think we will find ways to do that. So please email me and we will make that possible. And I think the other question, it does come from another person who's an outside researcher practitioner. How do we get involved with this? How do we get in touch with the organizations? Well, I think best approach is to get in touch via us. So we're happy to connect up and try and matchmake as much as possible. Lisa has a very quick question for you, Richard, about the information from the detailed study of prejudice and pride. How was that audience engagement? How was the information from that detailed study utilized?
Probably in a variety of ways. I think one of the things it did, or probably the most powerful thing it did, I think, is to tackle the the censorship and self-censorship within an organisation like the National Trust and others, in the face of what seems like, if you only look at the headlines, and you know, at the height of that controversy, not just people in our world, but kind of all my like neighbours and family, people who've got nothing to do with museums at all, they all knew, they'd all heard about it. But all they saw was headlines. So they were thinking there's this massive contravention of some kind of morality that we'd overstepped. And what we were able to do with that detailed audience research is show that that wasn't the case. There's mass support. And even from those people who were not, didn't ask for queer programming, didn't attend because of an interest in it, that came across it, that opened up all sorts of conversations for them and shifted their thinking. And we've captured all of that in that report. And it was able to kind of counter the idea that was kind of prevalent in the headlines. And so I think then give the organisations, not just the National Trust, but others, because we've made it publicly available, give them the confidence that this work matters, it's important, it has really positive effects, and to encourage them to do more.
Thank you. I will read out Steve Lennon. I'm going to read this out as a provocation rather than something for us to answer now, because it's quite a hefty topic to broach with the final minutes looming. We've already gone over time. So Steve's point is, do either of you feel that an exhibition of work which is solely by LGBTQ plus people, can it be interpreted as excluding? Because this is a problem that Steve had to overcome. But what I will ask you to answer as a final thought, I'm going to paraphrase Holly B's question here, which is Holly, she, her. It's what would your advice be for queer professionals, those who want to engage in this sort of work, but in terms of thinking about well-being, in terms of thinking about connection with the community, in terms of thinking about being compassionate to those who are still anxious about their identity, what would your advice be to the people who are tuning in from the Queer Heritage Collections Network? So final thoughts from both of you. Richard and then Robert, please.
I guess the problem in many situations has been queer people having to shoulder that and drive all of that forward, sometimes in the face of lack of interest or even hostility from their institutions. That is changing in really positive ways. And I think individuals, we often, you know, their motivation and their drive is really often crucial to making this work happen, but it has to be rooted in an institution's commitment and its stated support and values. And there's more opportunity for that to happen. So get your organisations on board. It's not a solo project. It's something that you should be able to draw in a whole range of other people, I would say.
I think my response is slightly more diffuse, but sincere nonetheless. I remember working on a major project with Peter Tatchell, gosh, 25 years ago, and being exposed to somebody who'd done so much, you know, vibrant, brave work in, you know, tackling our oppression. What I was struck by was, one, his capacity to have compassion and empathy for the audience that's potentially hostile, to try and remember that you're dealing with other human beings, and really think about upgrading your capacity for powerful listening, so that you're not just at the ramparts trying to battle your way into a hostile environment. Remember, it's a human terrain.
Obviously.
I love that.
That is lovely. So all I can say is, obviously, I hope you already believed it, but I hope you now see that it does make a difference, and you can make a difference. So in answering the question, what difference can we make? A lot. So I'm going to say this is the end of the symposium. So thank you so much for taking part and being part of this. It has been incredible. What a way to debut the network. So thank you again to the Art Fund for their wonderful grant that has made this possible. And thank you to the 5 partners. That's English Heritage, Historic England, Historic Royal Palaces, the National Trust, of course, and the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries. And thank you so much to the steering group. Thank you so much to the support team, and thank you very much to all of the people who have been involved in organizations outside of our own, who've joined the network, but also really brought together the last 2 days. That, I think, is enough. So I hope that everyone's going to give both Robert and Richard an incredible round of applause, and for all the speakers who have been with us for the last couple of days. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks to you too, Dan. It's been a great couple of days.
Thank you.